Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today on this edition of Framing the Future as we look ahead at issues that will shape the future of forestry and its management here in Maryland in the years ahead. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and this is our entering our late in the third year of our series this year. We're very pleased that you could join us today. I want to remind all of you the session is being recorded and will be made available later this month on the MarylandForestryFoundation.org website. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this series, a young woman who is one of our very first Mel Fellows and has continued to provide input and leadership for this program ever since its beginning. So let me turn it over to Megan Carr, one of the urban foresters in Baltimore City. Megan?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. So yeah, welcome everyone. Just a few notes as we're getting started. So in terms of housekeeping, we absolutely welcome audience participation, but you are limited in how you can participate. Please enter any questions that you have for our panelists into the Q&A function. That's the chat box. It should be, for most folks, down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have some time at the end of this session to address as many of those as we're able to. Again, this session is being recorded, and you can find that on the Maryland Forestry Foundation website, where you can also sign up to receive notifications for future webinars if you'd like to stay informed on other emerging issues in forest and ecosystem-related policy in and around Maryland. And with that, we're going to just jump right in. I'm very excited for today's discussion. Invasive species are, of course, a massive issue facing land managers statewide, region-wide, nationwide. And the three folks that are joining us today have been instrumental in guiding some new legislation that we hope will really strengthen our ability to sustainably manage native or native-dominated ecosystems going forward around the state of Maryland. We're joined by three folks from the Maryland Native Plant Coalition. Kirsten Hoffman is an executive board member of the Green Towson Alliance, which advocates for sustainable development and green infrastructure in the Towson area. She's the treasurer of the Maryland Native Plant Society and a founding member of the Maryland Native Plant Coalition that wrote and passed two important pieces of state legislation in the 2023 and 2024 legislative sessions, SB 836/HB 950, which created the Maryland Native Plants Program, and SB 915/HB 979, which we're discussing today, which strengthened Maryland's invasive plant laws. She is a Maryland Master Naturalist and is engaged in a habitat restoration project at Silburn Arboretum, and she's also a Blue Water Baltimore tree steward. We're also joined by Marie Laporte. After a professional career in business, Marie now lends her skills to the Sierra Club as a nearly full-time volunteer. She works on environmental advocacy, primarily on issues related to natural places, native and invasive plants, synthetic turf, and sustainability in the home garden. And finally, we're also joined by Judy Fulton, who is the founder of EcoPlant Consulting and who believes that healthy ecosystems are crucial for human survival. She transforms places overrun by invasives into native landscapes, shares her knowledge via workshops and field trips, and serves as an expert in invasive plant litigation. Judy is vice president of the Maryland Native Plant Society and a member of the Maryland Invasive Species Council and on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council. She has earned a Harvard MBA and has 3 times been recognized as one of Maryland's top 100 women from the Daily Record. During recent Maryland legislative sessions, Judy was pleased to help write and pass the 2023 Maryland Native Plants Program and the 2024 Maryland Invasive Plant Bill. Her consulting, her co-authoring of the Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide, and her role in creating the Mid-Atlantic Invaders Tool, which is an online guide to more than 900 invasive species, have positioned Judy as a sought-after advisor in ecological restoration. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our speakers. So thank you so much for lending us your time today.
All right, thank you, Megan. All right, I will share the screen again. Okay, is that good, everybody?
That looks great.
Okay. So again, thank you, Megan, for having us here today. Judy, Marie, and myself are really excited to share our experiences working on HB 979, SB 915. the Biodiversity and Agriculture Protection Act, which we more commonly call it the invasive plant bill. We feel this has been really important legislation, and it can be a bit on the technical side. So we're happy to have this opportunity to get into more depth with the members of the Maryland Forestry Foundation and guests today. All right, I'm going to stop sharing a moment because it's not advancing. We just checked it.
And sometimes you have to either click on it or hit the keyboard first. Depends on your operating system, I think.
Okay. I'm going to go back here and see if I start it up again here. There we go. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So our presentation today is going to focus both on the process of writing and passing the legislation, as well as on the components of the legislation itself. Briefly, we'll cover what we think of as kind of the 5 phases of work that led to the passage of the law. We'll talk about how we formed our team. Then probably the longest phase, gathering information, that then led us to figure out the elements that we needed to include in the legislation. And once we had a bill drafted, we turned our focus to building a wide range of support to get the bill passed. And last, even once a bill is passed, the work unfortunately is not done. And we'll talk about some steps that we are doing to ensure a smooth implementation. So our group came together, as we mentioned, in the 2023 General Legislative Assembly session. We were informal then, and we have kind of formalized ourselves as the Maryland Native Plant Coalition now. We're made up of the 5 groups that you see on the screen. 3 of us that here today represent the first 3 groups, the Sierra Club, Maryland Native Plant Society, and Green Towson Alliance. We are always open to individuals joining us and helping promote our mission to encourage the use of native plants and educate about the harm of invasive plants. So as I mentioned, we kind of came together informally in the 2023 General Assembly session when we worked on the Maryland Native Plant Program Bill. And this work was really a learning process that really helped us with the 2024 Invasive Plant Bill. So I wanted to just give you a very, very brief background on what the Native Plant Program does. This bill, HB 958, SB 836, had several elements. First, it creates a commercial Maryland native plant list. And this is a comprehensive list of Maryland native plants that are found in the nursery trade. It looks like the list is going to have around 600 plant species on it. So a very comprehensive list that'll be available both to nurseries and consumers, excuse me. It also sets up a voluntary certification program for plant retailers and wholesalers. And by participating in the program, by carrying Maryland native plants, they'll have access through the Department of Agriculture's Maryland's Best Program, advertising tools, and marketing. And finally, the bill increases education and awareness of native plants, which we think is so important, through a new position at the University of Maryland Extension for a native plant specialist. And this bill is in implementation right now, so keep an eye out for the results of it. So, as I mentioned, after we created and passed this legislation, our group decided to stay together and formally became the Maryland Native Plant Coalition. And after working on native plants, we wanted to turn our attention to invasive plants. We saw this really as a combined effort that those 2 pieces of legislation could work together. So phase 2, gathering information. The first thing we did was really try to look at a comprehensive history of where invasive plant laws were. And regulation of invasives really goes back to noxious weed laws, which were first passed in the US in the late 1800s. One of the first states to pass a noxious weed law was the state of Washington. And this was in 1881, and it was to combat Canada thistle. About 100 years later, the federal government passed their noxious weed law, and that was 1974. Today, almost all states, I've seen a statistic of 47 out of 50, have a noxious weed law. And the focus of these laws is typically on invasive plants that cause harm to agriculture. Many require landowners to control and prevent the spread of noxious weeds on their properties. Maryland's noxious weed law currently has 8 designated species as noxious weeds, And Maryland's law does require landowners to either eradicate or control noxious weeds on their property. The next key event that we looked at was an executive order from 1999, and it provided a definition of invasive species. And the definition is an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. This definition was amended in 2016 to add harm to animal and plant health as well as human health. And you'll find this definition in Maryland's invasive plant law, as well as in the laws of many other states. Maryland passed its first invasive plant law in 2011, followed up with amendments to that law in 2022. And I'll go through in a little more depth the law in the next few slides. And a few surrounding states, New York has a similar law to Maryland's that was passed in 2014. Delaware passed a law in 2024. And today, most states have either an invasive plant law, a noxious weed law, or both. So let's take a quick look at what the 2011 law did, and this is what established the invasive species regulatory framework in our state. There were kind of four key components of the law. First, it helped define what the Department of Agriculture was going to consider and regulate as an invasive plant species, and that was a commercial terrestrial plant. The regulatory framework did not extend to non-commercial plants, nor did it extend to aquatic plants. The law also called for the adoption of a scientific risk assessment protocol to determine invasiveness. It created a two-tier system to regulate our non-native invasives. Tier 1 species would be prohibited from sale, propagation, importation, transfer, purchase, and transport. Tier 2 species, which would be determined following the original assessment by a second assessment called the Maryland Screen, could still be sold, but they would require a warning signage at the point of sale. The bill also established the Invasive Species Advisory Council, better known as IPAC, which wrote regulations to carry out the implementation of the bill. And they meet periodically to review plant assessments and recommend plants to be added to either Tier 1 or Tier 2 status. So how did the implementation of this bill go? So first of all, let's back up 1 second and just talk about the assessment. So IPAC, the Invasive Species Advisory Council, adopted a plant assessment that was produced by the USDA, written by botanist Tony Coop. This is a weed risk assessment, and it evaluates the potential of a plant species to establish, spread, or cause harm in the area being assessed. So the focus was mainly on early detection, rapid response type species. And that's, you can see that that kind of reflects in this initial list here. So using that weed risk assessment, staff at MDA, DNR, and some outside experts began assessing invasive plants. Based on those assessments, these 6 plants were added to Tier 1, meaning they could no longer be sold or propagated in our state. 13 other plants were added to Tier 2 status. These plants can continue to be sold at Maryland nurseries with the warning sign that you see in the lower right there that says plant with caution. However, if you check the assessments for these plants and compare them to the assessment for the plants that are on Tier 1, you will find that these Tier 2 species were rated just as highly invasive as the Tier 1 species. So why were they assigned to Tier 2? The difference comes in the Maryland Screen. The Maryland Screen places plants on Tier 2 if they've been in the state longer than 50 years, if they're widely established, and if they're not harming threatened or endangered species. Some of the species on this list are still widely grown and sold by Maryland nurseries. And this is even after, they've been declared highly invasive. And today, after many years of having these plant with caution signs at the nurseries where they're being sold. 3 of these plants, barberry, burning bush, and Nandina, remain as significant moneymakers for the nursery industry in Maryland, parts of it. And you'll see later in the presentation that they emerged as a potential obstacle to the passage of our bill. So after about 10 years, so we'll come forward to 2021, 10 years of the law, There were still some unresolved issues, and the program was basically at a standstill. First, there were issues with the tier system. More and more concerned citizens were seeing invasive plants taking over parks, natural areas, their properties, and the limitations of this tier system were becoming more and more apparent. Many of the plants people were working to remove from their landscapes were for sale at their local nursery. And that caution sign that for tier 2 plants really was not particularly well understood by consumers, and consumers continued to buy plants such as barberry, burning bush, etc. And even though these tier 2 species are just as invasive as the tier 1 species, they'll never be able to be prohibited from sale due to the Maryland screen. The second kind of issues revolved around the risk assessment protocol. It was a very time-consuming protocol to complete. Some we've talked to likened it to writing a master's thesis per plant species being assessed. So it's after 2019, there were no new plant assessments completed, leaving us with just the 18 plants assessed and only 6 plants that were prohibited from sale. Finally, we had a staffing issue at MDA and DNR. There were key staff at those agencies that had worked on completing assessments, and by this point, they'd left their positions, and those positions had not been replaced. So there was no staff remaining at the agencies to complete plant assessments. So these issues led to an attempt to amend the 2011 law and get the assessment process restarted. The focus of the 2022 amendments was really to specify a list of invasive plants that would next be assessed. And the source document for that list is Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas. The addition in effect at the time of the 2022 law included 61 invasive plants and 19 watch plants. Now, some of these plants were already on our tier 1 and tier 2 list. Some were aquatics, some were non-commercial, but the law did result in a net add of, I believe, 48 species to the queue to be assessed as soon as there were staff to do assessments. One additional piece of this 2022 law dealt with native plants, and it required that state agencies and state-funded entities prioritize the planting of native plants. This is being implemented, but rather slowly, and the coalition is kind of looking at some strategies to really help the state move a little further into this. And there was no funding attached to this bill. There was a fiscal note, and the fiscal note stated that 3 new staff positions at MDA would be required for this bill to be implemented, 2 new plant assessors and 1 nursery inspector. But with no funding, that unfortunately did not happen. So at this point in our research, we wanted to see what other states were doing. And I have a quick chart here just to kind of compare. And we first started looking at mid-Atlantic states, and then we started looking at a few in the Northeast and a few in the Midwest. And you can see from the charts that some states have both an invasive plant law and a noxious weed law, like Maryland and Delaware. Some regulate solely through a noxious weed law, like Pennsylvania and Virginia. And one state, Massachusetts, has combined their laws for a combined amount of prohibited invasive plants of 144, which is pretty amazing. New Jersey passed a law in 2023 that would have prohibited 29 invasive species. It was unfortunately vetoed by their governor. We understand it's going to be reintroduced though. So kind of looking across the bottom line, you can see if we add up the amount of species prohibited through invasive plant legislation with our noxious weeds, Maryland only has 14 prohibited plant species. And compared to other states, we have some work to do. And we kind of realized that, and that's where we started moving forward to see how can we catch up to our surrounding states. So at this point, I'm going to pass the presentation off to Judy Fulton, and she can go through our next steps.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks for setting the stage. In this section, I'll get into the weeds, pun intended, and I'll emphasize some of the points that Kirsten has already made. A year ago, we were already several months into working on this new bill. We started, as Kirsten said, by taking stock of the prior legislation, with only a little progress being evident on that, really MDA was stalled by the lack of staff, which they had tried year after year to add. So as a result of the shortage of staff, the list of species had been increasing, the backlog, especially with the 2022 law, but no assessments were done. The tier system hadn't been especially effective. Because of that Maryland screen, only 6 species were banned by being listed as tier 1 after being assessed, because that screen just created too high a bar. And as Kirsten mentioned, the 2-tier system wasn't particularly effective. The tier 2 sign, among other things, says plant with caution. Well, it's great to plant with caution, but if you're planting it at all, you're contributing to the pressure on natural areas, and the number of invasive species out in the natural areas is going to be increasing. The scope was quite limited to just the commercial terrestrial invasive plant species, because there are a lot of other species that are invasive here in Maryland or at risk for becoming invasive. As a background for all of this, every decade there was more damage being done to the environment, more economic harm, because the number of species and the number of plants in those species were really increasing in Maryland every decade. It's not a linear line in terms of increase. It's more like exponential growth. And we felt a great deal of urgency, because if we waited for another 10 years, the situation would really be compounded in terms of the harm. We started the whole process by really talking to a lot of people. We talked to experts within Maryland and also in nearby states. We contacted people at DNR and also staff at MDA to discuss how things were working and what could be done to improve the situation. We went to other states and reviewed both the assessment protocols that were used to determine if a species was invasive, and also the specific plants that had assessments. We looked at commercial availability. There are almost 300 invasive plants, both terrestrial and aquatic, that are listed by the Maryland Invasive Species Council. There were many that are sold here in Maryland, but others are sold also in other states. And almost all the plants could be available for purchase on the internet. So one of our concerns was that even if they weren't currently being sold in Maryland, any plant that was being sold in the US could easily come to Maryland, and a nursery could decide to start selling it. We created a survey so we could better understand what was going on throughout the state with invasive plants. And very importantly, we also created a more efficient assessment protocol than the one that had been used to date, that Kirsten mentioned could take 7 to 8 weeks to complete. And we trialed that with a team of expert terrestrial botanists and a team of aquatic representatives. In terms of the survey, we were very interested and pleased to get 1,400 responses in just a few weeks that we had the survey available for people to respond to. There were many respondents, but the largest numbers were property owners, landscapers, master gardeners, experts with invasive plants, and farmers. Not surprisingly, again, we had the same invasive species come up over and over again, no matter who the respondent was and what group they represented. That was throughout Maryland, because this survey was meant to understand not just the greater Baltimore, Washington area, but also Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. And some of the respondents were just across the state's borders. One of the things that came through loud and clear was that the respondents were very frustrated by what they saw with the invasive plants taking over more and more, creating increased pressure on natural areas, and also becoming much more expensive to manage because of the numbers that people had to deal with. This was all happening at the same time that nurseries were continuing to sell these invasives. So there was frustration that, say, a volunteer might clear a park of the English ivy growing on trees just to see the neighbor right next to the park for the first time planting English ivy that they had just purchased. The DNR also expressed a lot of interest in expanding the scope to include aquatic plants. This slide shows a view of the 15 invasives that were mentioned most frequently. For this chart, we decided to group some species that were in the same genera together because respondents often couldn't tell the difference between two very similar species. The top vote getters are barberry and English ivy, followed by Japanese stiltgrass and tree of heaven. Interestingly, these top 4 invasives represent different plant habits: shrub, vine, and grass, and also tree. Many of the comments, and since this is for a forestry organization, this is particularly appropriate. Many of the comments in the survey were about invasive vines taking over forests or killing trees. Of the 15 invasives on this list, 6 are vines. So I think that's very interesting and shows how much harm are being done to our forests and also our trees in other settings. This slide also comes from the survey. We didn't include Tier 1, the prohibited species, on the survey because we didn't feel we'd learn that much from that, but we did include the Tier 2 species and a large number of other species, and then people could write in what particular invasive species they wanted to. So this chart takes the top 15 species that were mentioned in the survey and shows their status in other mid-Atlantic states with invasive plant species laws. The red boxes show invasive plants that are prohibited from sale and propagation, and the purple shows species that are regulated but still sold. So Maryland's Tier 2. Our surrounding states have prohibited quite a few more plants than Maryland residents have been dealing with here. For example, if you look at Japanese barberry, you can see that that shrub is prohibited in Delaware, New York, and Pennsylvania, but it's just on the Tier 2 list.
Good.
With that background information, we decided to set the goals for the 2024 law. We wanted to absolutely increase the number of species that are not sold or propagated in the state. We wanted to add aquatic species that the DNR is really concerned about. And we also wanted to add those non-commercial species because those are also damaging natural areas, our lands and waters. And as I mentioned before, we don't want those to sneak into the state and start being sold. We also wanted to bring Maryland more in line with other mid-Atlantic states. There's considerable research ongoing right now that shows that focusing on a small area, either an area within a state or a whole state, really is not going to effectively address the invasive plant problem. You have to go with larger regions. And a typical saying that I hear a lot is that plants don't know about political borders. So you have to treat them the way they live. The overarching goal is to help with slowing the drop in biodiversity and also slowing climate change. The idea was to do what we could at the state level. We didn't want the spread of invasive plants pushing out native plants and animals. Just yesterday, I was talking to someone and she mentioned that the Baltimore checker spot is probably going to be leaving the state because of all the pressures. And one of the pressures is invasive plants. We want to protect our natural areas and more. As Kirsten said, this is a very technical bill. So we focused on improving the process initially. We want to have more assessments possible, done more efficiently by MDA, DNR, IPAC, the Invasive Plant Advisory Committee, and outside experts. We want the 2022 law to be implemented to get to that list from plant invaders that was added to the backlog. And the Maryland Department of Agriculture, MDA, is chronically short-staffed, and we wanted to help by reducing the need for nursery inspections. Staff wouldn't have to wander around nurseries looking for that tier 2 signage. And we wanted to create a single consolidated list. We wanted an efficient and clear approach for the public. We wanted a comprehensive approach that was going to work for the whole state and all the plants in the state. Initially, we thought we would be putting funding into the bill, but then it turns out that there were 3 pins put in for 3 positions in the budgeting process. Here's a chart to compare the 2011 law with the 2024 law. The idea was to expand from terrestrial and commercial species to also include the aquatic and the non-commercial. Instead of having 2 tiers, the new law now has just the category prohibited. Tier 1 has already gone into that prohibited list. Tier 2, we're going to look at, or I should say MDA and IPAC and DNR are going to look at reassessing those and verifying that they are invasive. If they're not invasive, at this point, they would score lower and be put in the watch list. But frankly, as Kirsten said, if you look at the assessments, all of the species are definitely invasive, whether they're on the tier 1 or tier 2 list. So we anticipate that after reassessments, the results will show that those plants should also be prohibited. Once a plant gets on the watch list, it gives it extra visibility. It's not regulated, but the watch list species will be watched, and it will be determined whether the situation has changed and then whether it makes sense doing a reassessment to see whether those have become invasive. With the original legislation, the primary target was newer invasives killing rare, threatened, and endangered plant species, and also damaging rare habitats. That's been expanded to also include widespread species, but there still will be an emphasis on the EDRR, the new species or species that might come into Maryland at any point. As I mentioned, the funding was included in the budget, unfortunately, with Governor Moore putting pressure on all the state agencies. It looks doubtful that all 3 MDA staff positions will be added. Hopefully, MDA will get 1 position. But because the assessment process has been simplified, it's much more likely that volunteer expert assessors will get involved and will pass plants to IPAC to be determined whether those will be prohibited plants. The protocol has gone from the USDA risk assessment, an excellent protocol, but very involved, to, for the most part, a more efficient status assessment protocol. If a species is not yet in Maryland, and there will be very few of those that will be go through the assessment process, those would still need a risk assessment. The status assessment comes from Delaware and from NatureServe. The Delaware assessment was was used for the 2022 invasive species law in Delaware, and it came from NatureServe's protocol too. So through 2 routes, we've brought in what NatureServe put together. No states near Maryland appear to be using the USD risk assessment at this point. Besides Delaware, Virginia and New York use assessment protocols that are based on NatureServe. There are 7 southeastern states that are in the process of being of using the NatureServe protocol, a slightly modified version that is based on that. And Pennsylvania is also looking at a protocol based on NatureServe's protocol. So again, I mentioned addressing invasive plants in a whole larger region, and that is what we're doing now. We're eliminating tier 2, as I mentioned, and that means we're eliminating the Maryland screen. That will allow widespread plants to also be prohibited, and plants that are 50 or more years old in terms of presence here. And that's particularly good for sleeper species. Also, the newer protocol, the replacement protocol, which I have to say, IPAC is still determining exactly how that will look. It's not definitive at this point yet, but it does not include a lot of specialized software that you needed a subscription for. So overall, they're very clear goals, and the protocol is going to hopefully solve a lot of problems that we wanted to when we started working on this. Marie, do you want to take over here?
Thank you, Judy. So going back a little bit, after we had the framework of what we really wanted to accomplish with the legislation, that was the time to reach out and find bill sponsors. And you want to engage these people early and find them and get them up to speed on the issue and also get their input. As Kirsten had mentioned, we had worked together on the Native Plant Programs Act, and Senator Brooks had worked on that as a bill sponsor. And Delegate Foley had expressed an interest to be involved. And so she also was signed on. Next. Legislators want to get their bills passed, but you really need a very strong effort to get the support that you need to get something passed. Each of these people only represents, a relatively small area with their constituents. And so we really needed to develop a marketing plan, if you will, for the stakeholders. As we mentioned, we had that survey, which was fabulous. It really went far beyond what we had expected. We had 1,400 people respond, and they were passionate about this issue. So they were a really good starting point. We had gardeners, as mentioned. One of our members is from Garden Clubs of America, which is a small but very, fervent sort of group about gardening and practices. Environmental groups, agency staff, the Farm Bureau, and the nursery trade, Magic. I do want to mention, we were doing outreach with many of these different groups, trying to get their buy-in. Early on, we were, we met with Magic and their board members before we even had a bill written. We just had the framework, and we wanted to make sure that we socialized it with them and got their early input. And that was very constructive, trying to build that relationship and find common ground. One of the areas where we really didn't have a lot of expertise, though, was with farmers or the Farm Bureau. Thankfully, we were able to identify some farmers, one in particular, actually, who was from Virginia and was a past Farm Bureau president in that state. And he wrote wonderful testimony about the very unfortunate situation that he's experienced on his property, which has been in his family, since the late 1700s. This is not just a business, for these people. This is their heritage. And in this case, a neighboring property had planted this Chinese silvergrass, and it had spread throughout his property and was really impacting the ability for his livestock to forage. And he's really at a crossroads right now. He's an older gentleman, and he doesn't really know what to do. Does he give up? Does he give up the farm? Because it has been so devastating to him. Next. So we also had to, as I said, we have to try to get all the other delegates and state senators interested in our legislation. And to give you some perspective, there are literally, about 3,000 different bills that are introduced every year. So this is not a small undertaking. And there's a lot of things that are sort of kitchen table issues that people are really concerned about. And getting attention on something like invasive plants, which is an important issue for many people. But you're competing with a lot of different things. So we leveraged the people who completed the survey, and we thought, well, we did the survey, we've got these results, these are really interesting. If I did the survey, I'd kind of want to know what it said. So we did a webinar, and we had about 500 people who signed up for that. We leveraged social media, and we had a few hundred followers. We created fact sheets and FAQs to help explain what we were trying to achieve, which was important for both people who wanted to you know, sign on and support, but also for the representatives to vote on it. We had to build relationships with other organizations. We had meetings with environmental groups before the legislative session, which was really helpful because once the legislative session starts, you know, they're looking at hundreds of different pieces of legislation. And it's really hard for them to pay attention to your bill. So if you've got something early on, you know, and you can get them before the deluge, that's really helpful. And, you know, we also use things like online petitions and things. And some of those other environmental groups, because we talked to them in advance, were very supportive of getting their membership aware. I was invited to go to Audubon's I Bird, I Vote event. I was one of their speakers. So their members got to hear about, you know, invasive plants, and they care about that. There were other groups like Blue Water Baltimore that also did sign on online petitions. And this is really helpful because these online petitions, you know, they're the kind of thing where you auto-populate your information. Sometimes you have the ability to write your own comments. And then the note goes directly to your representatives. So they hear from, you know, Sue Smith, who lives in Baltimore, about why she cares about this particular issue. Next. Now, through the legislative process, you know, I'm not going to say it's easy because it isn't. But you have to learn to compromise, and you have to know what your limits of those compromises are. So one of the things early on that came up was that, you know, the nursery industry wanted to allow sterile cultivars, as long as there's a proof of sterility, to be exempted. And we did agree to that. Now, there are obviously things like, you know, the Bradford or calorie pair, which originally believed to be sterile, but then was not, as it found a mate. You know, so it can be a little bit problematic, but, you know, you have to sometimes make some concessions. The other thing is, as was mentioned earlier, we originally wanted to just move the tier 2 plants, which are equally harmful, to tier 1 status. They'd already been assessed with the original protocol, but the nursery industry really wanted us to reassess them before moving. Essentially, that kind of buys a little bit more time for them. They wanted to add qualifications for the expert assessor. And this was actually more MDA, I think, that was leading this one. And then to create an exception for Maryland state highways. And the other thing too is throughout this process, your bill sponsors are going to be working on, you know, finding common ground with you. So there might be some things they support that you may not, or they, you know, you just kind of have to navigate that together and help explain things to each other. So there was one issue though at the end that, you know, we just could not come to a compromise. And this is to allow propagation for nurseries if they wanted to sell it out of state. And the obvious reason is if you're selling it, if you're doing it in a nursery, it's going to be escaping into the wild wherever that nursery is. That's the vector. And so it didn't make sense. Even shipping it out could also, you know, have seeds and stuff go. And also we're just exporting problems, which doesn't make sense. So we opted not to do that. And the bill did pass with a couple of nurseries who very much tried to kill the bill at the end. Next. So as was mentioned before, you know, you also have to make sure that we ensure implementation. You know, it's not out of malice, but, you know, many people within the state, you know, are not aware of the new legislation, especially in other agencies. They already have 100 things that they're working on, and adding this other new law and compliance is not easy. And sometimes they don't get the staffing that they need to do the implementation. So as was mentioned before, the budget originally contained 3 staff positions for MDA. We believe that some of those positions may be cut in the latest cut. We haven't seen that. But at least one is there. And, you know, you have to also depend on IPAC, and IPAC is a volunteer organization. You know, these people are in these positions, but they're not getting paid to do so, to actually work to make sure that this gets moved along. And with the, you know, this implementation, the priorities are obviously to reassess tier 2 so that hopefully most or all of them will move to tier 2 prohibited. And also to get assessments on the plants that are in the plant invaders of the mid-Atlantic natural areas, which was part of the 2022 legislation. Next. So some key dates. So the bill was signed in May. It became effective in June. MDA has started their hiring process as of July 1st. IPAC had a meeting yesterday, and then they'll have another meeting in a couple of months to work on implementation of to determine the assessment exactly and make sure that they're on board with that. And then hopefully some hires, or at least one hire, will start in the fall and can actually start working on this legislation. And lastly, all of these tier 2 assessments are due, over a year from now. So it's a very long process. And then there's a selling period that follows that. So there's 1 year for herbaceous or potted plants and 2 years for woody plants. Next. And just some final comments. So the key things, when you're working on legislation is you do need a team of people to work. You bring different perspectives and different skill sets. You need people who are really dedicated to the issue and really, willing to show up and do what they need to get done. You also have to leverage each other's individual strengths. Some people are subject matter experts. I am not an expert. I am a home gardener, but my business skills actually are surprisingly helpful in this endeavor because I have good communication skills. I have good organization skills. So you have to find what works for you. And also there's some things that you learn when you're working with different people. When we had some of these last minute objections to the legislation and, issues with the nursery, it was really hard for me to stay calm. Let's just say that, because here we'd involved magic early on and it wasn't out of malice that these things came up. It's just some of these people hear about things later and that's when you get the objection. But it's very frustrating when you're at the 11th hour and you think you've gotten sign off from everybody. I'll just say this, Kirsten is fabulously calm under these kinds of pressure situations. And she was able to be, a really good liaison with, magic and industry and kind of work some of these last minute issues out. So you have to know what your personal strength is. I knew I was not the right person at that point in time to do that. And I kind of stepped back and let her take over on that. So you have to find, what works for your group. And obviously we want to point out, we understand that this legislation is not going to solve the problem, in its entirety, not by a long shot. The horse has left the barn. There are many different invasive plants. And we are going to have to continue to work to get resources to remove them, to educate homeowners, to stop, letting these things grow on their property, hopefully remove them and plant other things. There's a really great site with Northern Virginia Tree Rescuer, where they have a lot of great education on many different invasives and what people can do, which is really helpful. And so, it's part of a long journey, but this was a really good, important improvement to our existing legislation, and we hope it will make a significant difference. Questions?
Yep. There is us.
All right. Well, that was really excellent. Thank you all so much for sharing all of that. It's a lot of info. I'll drop a quick reminder for folks that if you would like to rewatch this presentation, as I am likely to do, that'll be available at the Maryland Forestry Foundation website, which is marylandforestryfoundation.org. Just click on webinars and you'll find this and all of our previous sessions as well. We have a handful of questions and comments and more questions coming in. So I'll be reading those out for those who are watching this at a future date. I'll just start in order. Esther commented that she was surprised Japanese knotweed didn't emerge during that survey. I'm not sure if it did, or were there any surprising findings from the survey itself?
I wouldn't say that there was anything that surprised us. And yes, Japanese knotweed was one of the species that was mentioned. It just wasn't one of the top 15 in terms of frequency.
Let's see. Alicia asks a question that you could interpret a few ways, but what can we do to help?
Well, one thing I want to mention is, first of all, if you have invasives, to make sure that you manage them on your own property. And if you want to volunteer in some way and help with us and our coalition, we could always use, an extra set of hands working on things. So one of the things that we'd like to do at Sierra Club is we would like to build a site very similar to what Northern Virginia has created with Tree Rescuer. And we need to have, we're going to leverage some of their content, but, things like that. If we have people who have that kind of skill set, that could be great. There are also people who are doing lead warrior, training, so that they can actually go out, outside of their own property, or even if you live in an apartment, you can get trained as a weed warrior and help someplace else.
And
I
let me
would
just-
also like to add that for people, both private citizens and government employees, to manage invasives, we need to know where they are. So please report the plants, and there are certain apps. Probably the best one to use is something called EDDMAPS, EDDMAPS. It's both a mobile app and you can access it online. If you want something that's used more often to report plants, both good plants and bad plants, iNaturalist is another option. So it's really crucial that people, if they see an invasive, they take a picture and they enter it in one of these two apps. That's very important. And I also want to comment, both Megan and I were at the Maryland Invasive Species Council quarterly meeting today, and there are increasing numbers of volunteer programs that are in the process of being put in place. So if you look now and you can't find a weed warrior program, look in another few months or next year, and it would be great if you could help out with that.
And I guess I always stress education. If you have the knowledge of the invasive plants, share it. Share it with your friends, share it with your neighbors. When you go to your local nurseries, share it there. Everyone that you can talk to spread the word. Because a lot of this kind of gets spread from one person at a time. When we especially when we go around our neighborhoods and point out things in a friendly way to your neighbors. So there's just a lot of people that aren't aware of the issues. And so we really need everyone that can to spread the word.
And I'll just note, it's 2:00 now. Are you all able to hang on for maybe a couple more minutes to tackle a few more questions?
Sure.
Sure.
Wonderful, thank you. So another question, one that I was curious about as well, from an anonymous attendee. Why was the exception made for Maryland state highways? And does that mean invasives could still be planted there?
So for that, it's not a matter of planting them. It's a matter of controlling them and how to dispose of material. For instance, if calorie pear is pulled up, and the state highways estimated it would cost $50,000 if they had to follow every single aspect of the law in terms of disposal. So they wanted to have an opportunity to talk to MDA and work out something that was appropriate both for state highways and acceptable to MDA. So absolutely, this doesn't let them plant invasive plants. It's just a disposal issue.
Right, trying to sort through some of the questions and comments coming in. And some things are maybe getting into whole other topics of their own. So trying to keep the focus on this specific bill. So we have a question from Dawn on action to distinguish cultivars and local ecotype plants. Whether that would conceivably be part of any of the legislation that you all are working on.
So we're not getting into invasives in this legislation. I mean, not natives in this legislation. But the cultivars were definitely dealt with, as Marie said. They're actually, IPAC already had a way to deal with cultivars. But there was a request that wasn't laid out in the 2011 or 2022 laws. There was a request to explicitly put that into the law. So we took what is actually being done and put it into the law itself. And what's being done, and again, Marie touched on this, is a cultivar is banned if the invasive species is banned. So all cultivars of an invasive species are banned. However, if there's a cultivar that can be proven to be sterile, and when I say sterile, that's both in propagules like seeds and also vegetatively, if it can be proven to be sterile, and there are very stringent requirements for that, then there can be an exception. For instance, there's one Nandina, I think it's called Firepower, that really is sterile. We've learned from Calorie Pear. So Bradford pear, a Bradford pear equivalent would never pass the screen and be allowed to be sold. Does that answer that question?
I mean, if he's asking about native plants, that was somewhat addressed in our 2023 bill. The commercial plant list is just a list of straight species. And those are plants that nurseries will be able to label as a Maryland native. They won't be labeling cultivars, they'll just be labeling straight species. And the local ecotype movement is gaining ground, and it's not got like definite rules at this point, so it's really hard to hold nurseries to. There's lots of different ways people define it. So we're looking at working that somewhat into the native plant program, but right now it's just kind of in development. So we're definitely trying to look at it.
Yeah, and part of the challenge is honestly just finding the native plants to begin with.
Yeah.
Not even getting to the specificity of, I want my local ecotype, you're just happy if you can find the native plant, and it's coming from your state, a neighboring state, and not from, Illinois or something,
Yeah.
All right, well, we're at 2:05, so I guess in closing, I'll just echo a few things that are also in the comments queue of thank you so much for doing this extremely hard work from Lori. And Rachel, who says, just want to say bravo to you all. This is so unbelievably needed. Yes, and thank you for taking the time out to share all this information. This is a really great presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time. Gary, any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much, Megan, and I want to thank our panelists for this program. Excellent work, very informative, very useful to many hundreds of people across the state. I want to remind all of those who've tuned in to it today, we had excellent participation, that I hope you'll join us the third Thursday of August for our next program, which will focus on a issue that many people are familiar with, and that is renovation of urban areas, following a book issued by the U.S. Forest Service called the Green Pattern Book. And we'll be talking about what can be done to save urban open spaces, what can be done to renovate those spaces, what could be done to help upgrade and repopulate green spaces in urban areas. Join us next month and continue our traditions for framing the future. the issues that'll frame the questions of forestry and Maryland's future. And I want to again thank all of our panelists and all of you who've joined us today. Have a good day and see you next month.